So Canada just cut the lifeline. The bilateral automotive integration framework, the system that has allowed the North American auto industry to function as a single seamless cross-border manufacturing ecosystem for over half a century, was terminated by Ottawa this morning. Effective in 30 days, every auto part, every component, every sub-assembly that crosses the US-Canada border will face full tariff treatment at every crossing. No exemptions, no preferential rates, no integration provisions. The single largest component of US-Canada bilateral trade, approximately $150 billion annually, just had its arterial connection severed. One cut, clean, surgical, already done. And the White House was stunned. Not angry. Stunned. There is a difference between those two words, and it matters. Angry means you saw it coming and you're furious it happened. Stunned means you didn't see it coming and you don't yet know how to respond. Trump's advisors had told him Canada would never do this, that the automotive integration was mutually assured destruction, that both sides depended on it equally, that severing it would hurt Canada as much as America, and therefore it was untouchable. They were wrong. Canada spent 8 months building the alternative partnerships and the industrial infrastructure that made this cut survivable for Canada. And then, without warning, without diplomatic notice, without a single advanced signal to Washington, Canada made the cut. Warren Buffett's response was 2 words followed by an analysis that is being called the most devastating economic assessment of the entire trade war. The 2 words they prepared. When you hear what he means by that, how Canada systematically built the alternative automotive partnerships that made this severance survivable for Ottawa and catastrophic for Detroit, you'll understand why Ford, GM, and Stellantis are in emergency board sessions right now, and why the price of every American-made car is about to increase by thousands of dollars. When you see what was just severed, what it meant for the American auto industry and the millions of jobs that depend on it, why Canada can survive this cut and America can't, and what Buffett says about the prognosis for every American who drives, buys, or manufactures a car, you'll understand why this single action might be the most economically devastating move Canada has made in the entire trade war. Subscribe now because the bleeding has already started. Here's what Canada did specifically, because the precision of this action is part of what makes it so devastating. Ottawa announced the termination of Canada's participation in the bilateral automotive supply chain integration agreements, the framework that governs how auto parts, components, and finished vehicles move across the US-Canada border under preferential terms. The termination includes a 30-day transition period after which every piece of automotive trade between the 2 countries faces full tariff treatment with no exemptions, no carve-outs, and no preferential rates of any kind. Prime Minister Carney's statement was characteristically precise and devastatingly framed. The North American automotive integration was built on partnership. It was built on the assumption that both nations would maintain a cooperative economic relationship in which shared manufacturing served shared prosperity. When that partnership was replaced by tariffs, threats, demands for sovereignty concessions, and the destruction of every comprehensive framework designed to sustain the relationship, the integration became a vulnerability we could not afford to maintain. Canada's automotive sector will now serve the global market through partnerships that are reciprocal, respectful, and durable. Carney didn't frame this as retaliation. He framed it as adaptation, not we're punishing America, but the partnership no longer exists. So the framework built for that partnership no longer serves Canadian interests. The distinction matters because it positions the severance not as an escalation but as an acknowledgement of reality. Reality that Washington created simultaneously with the termination announcement. Ottawa released the details of what it had been building for months. A $25 billion Canadian government investment fund to reorient the Canadian auto sector toward European, Asian, and global partners. The fast-tracking of Volkswagen's $7 billion Gigafactory, a massive electric vehicle manufacturing facility on Canadian soil that represents the largest automotive investment in Canadian history. 3 additional European and Asian automotive partnership agreements signed and ready for implementation. Canadian auto workforce retraining programs fully funded and already enrolling workers in communities that will be affected by the transition. Canada didn't just sever the connection. Canada had already built a replacement. The $2 billion investment, the VW Gigafactory, the European and Asian partnerships, the workforce programs, all of it was in place before the announcement. This wasn't a reactive decision made in anger. This was the execution of a plan that was months in the making, designed with the same strategic patience that has characterized every major Canadian action in this trade war. Build the alternative, fund the alternative, test the alternative, and only then, only when the alternative is operational and the transition is manageable, make the cut. The timing and the surprise are part of the strategy. No advanced warning was given to Washington. No diplomatic heads-up, no back-channel consultation, no gradual escalation that would have given the White House time to prepare a response or mount a counter-strategy. The American ambassador was notified after the public announcement, not before Washington learned about the severance of the most important bilateral trade mechanism between the two countries from a press conference Trump reportedly learned from a television broadcast. His first reaction, according to multiple reports, "They can't do that." They can. They did. And the 30-day clock is already ticking. So, Canada severed the auto integration. The question now is, what did America just lose? Because the answer is bigger, deeper, and more consequential than most Americans realize. The North American automotive industry was designed, engineered at the molecular level over decades of cooperative industrial policy to treat the US-Canada border is invisible. Parts flow back and forth across that border like blood through a circulatory system. An engine block cast in Ontario crosses into Michigan for machining. It crosses back into Ontario for assembly into a powertrain. It crosses into Michigan again for installation into a vehicle chassis. The chassis crosses into Ontario for painting and finishing. The finished vehicle crosses back into Michigan for final quality inspection and distribution. That's one component making 5 crossings during the production of a single vehicle. And many components make 7 or more. The average car assembled in North America involves auto parts crossing the US-Canada border approximately 7 times during the manufacturing process. 7 times. Each crossing under the integration framework was essentially frictionless, treated as movement within a single manufacturing system rather than as international trade requiring tariff assessment. Without the integration framework, every one of those crossings becomes a tariff event. And the math is where this becomes catastrophic. A 25% tariff on a component that crosses the border 7 times does not add 25% to the cost. The tariff compounds because at each crossing, the duty is assessed on the cumulative value of the component, including all previously paid tariffs. A $500 component that crosses 7 times at 25% doesn't accumulate $125 in total tariff costs. It accumulates closer to $800 to $1,000 because each tariff is calculated on the value plus the previous tariffs, creating an exponential cost escalation. That was precisely why the integration framework existed in the first place. The framework wasn't a preference or a convenience. It was the mathematical prerequisite for competitive auto manufacturing in North America. The result, $3,000 to $8,000 added to the cost of every vehicle assembled in North America, depending on the model and the complexity of its cross-border supply chain. Every American who buys a car, every family that finances a vehicle, every fleet operator that orders trucks, every business that depends on transportation, every ambulance service and police department and delivery company just absorbed a cost increase that originated from a single decision made in Ottawa. Not from a Canadian tariff on American cars, from the compounding effect of American tariffs applied 7 times to parts that cross an invisible line during manufacture. America's own tariffs applied to its own supply chain at a frequency that makes the cost explosion geometric rather than linear. Ford, GM, and Stellantis are in emergency sessions. All three have issued urgent statements warning of significant production disruption, massive cost increases, and the potential closure of plants that depend most heavily on the integrated cross-border supply chain. Ford's F-150, the best-selling vehicle in America for over 4 decades. The backbone of Ford's profitability, the truck that defines American automotive identity, has Canadian-made components in its engine, its transmission, its body structure, its aluminum panels, and its electronic control systems. Stripping those components out and replacing them with American or non-Canadian alternatives would require redesigning the vehicles entire supply chain from scratch, identifying new suppliers, qualifying new parts, retooling assembly processes, and establishing new logistics networks. That's not a 6-month adjustment. That's a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar restructuring of the single most important product in American automotive manufacturing. And during that restructuring, every F-150 rolling off the assembly line costs thousands of dollars more than it did before the cut. GM's electric vehicle program, the centerpiece of its corporate strategy for the next decade, representing tens of billions in committed investment, depends on Canadian battery materials, including lithium and nickel, Canadian assembly capacity at its Oshawa and Seoul facilities, and a Canadian supplier network that was purpose-built under the integration framework for the EV transition. The severance doesn't just disrupt GM's current production, it threatens the viability of GM's future. Stellantis faces similar cross-border dependencies across multiple vehicle lines. The Windsor assembly plant alone is integrated with dozens of American supplier relationships that now face tariff compounding at every crossing. The Big Three spent decades building these supply chains through billions of dollars in patient cooperative bilateral investment. Restructuring them takes years and costs tens of billions more. And during every year of that restructuring, American-made vehicles are more expensive, less competitive, and harder to produce than vehicles made in countries that didn't sever their own manufacturing partnerships. The jobs are the human dimension that makes this more than an industrial story. Hundreds of thousands of American auto workers in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, and Tennessee depend on the integrated supply chain. Not just the assembly line workers, but the part suppliers, the logistics companies, the tool and die shops, the component manufacturers, the trucking firms that move parts across the border 7 times during a single vehicle's production. An ecosystem of American livelihoods built around cross-border integration that was just severed. Michigan, especially, a state whose economy is more deeply tied to auto manufacturing than any other, faces the kind of economic disruption that reshapes communities for a generation. Michigan voted for the president who started the trade war. Michigan's economy depends on the auto integration that Canada just terminated. That's not irony. That's a political crisis, arriving on the doorstep of the administration that created it. And then Warren Buffett responded. 2 words, they prepared. What Canada just did was not impulsive. Buffett said, it was not reactive. It was not a tantrum or a negotiating bluff or a gesture designed to bring Washington to the table. It was the execution of a plan that was designed months ago, resourced with $25 billion in government investment, supported by alternative partnerships with Volkswagen and European and Asian automakers, backed by trade agreements through CETA and CPTP that give Canadian automotive exports tariff-free access to the European and Asia-Pacific markets and time to coincide with the precise moment when Canadian alternatives were operational and American dependency was at its maximum. The difference between this and every other retaliatory action in the trade war is preparation depth. Canada didn't cut the lifeline and hope for the best. Canada built the replacement, tested the replacement, funded the replacement, staffed the replacement, and only then cut the lifeline. That's not retaliation. That's strategy. And the strategy gap between Ottawa and Washington is now visible to the entire world on the survivability asymmetry. And this is where Buffett's analysis becomes devastating. The cut is survivable for Canada. Canada has CETA, which gives its automotive exports tariff-free access to the European market, for 150 million consumers. Canada has CPTP, which gives it access to Japanese and Asian automakers looking for manufacturing partners. Canada has the Germany corridor, Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes, all of whom are investing in Canadian production capacity. Canada has $25 billion in government transition funding. Canada has the world's attention because every automaker on Earth now knows that Canadian manufacturing capacity, Canadian workers, and Canadian supply chains are available. Not theoretically. Now, the cut is not survivable in its current form for the American auto industry. America does not have a replacement for